Black Americans of Achievement, Elijah Muhammad. Malu, Halasa, Senior Consulting Editor Nathan Irvin Huggins, Director W.E.V. Dubois, Institute for African American Research, Harvard University, Chelsea House Publishers. On Achievement, Coretta Scott King. Before you begin this book, I hope you will ask yourself what the word excellence means to you. I think that it's a question we should all ask and keep asking as we grow older and change, because the truest answer to it should never change. When you think of excellence, perhaps you think of success at work, or of becoming wealthy, or meeting the right person, getting married and having a good family life. Those important goals are worth striving for, but there is a better way to look at excellence. As Martin Luther King Jr. said in one of his last sermons, I want you to be the first in love. I want you to be the first in moral excellence. I want you to be the first in generosity. I want you to be important, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. My husband, Martin Luther King Jr., knew that the true meaning of achievement is service. When I met him in 1952, he was already ordained as a Baptist preacher and was working toward a doctoral degree at Boston University. I was studying at the New England Conservatory and dreamed of accomplishments in music. We married a year later, and after I graduated the following year, we moved to Montgomery, Alabama. We didn't know it then, but our notions of achievement were about to undergo a dramatic change. You have read or heard about what happened next. What began with the boycott of a local bus line grew into a national movement, and by the time he was assassinated in 1968, my husband had fashioned a black movement powerful enough to shatter forever the practice of racial segregation. What you may not have read about is where he got his method for resisting injustice without compromising his religious beliefs. He adopted the strategy of nonviolence from a man of a different race who lived in a distant country and even practiced a different religion. The man was Mahatma Gandhi, the great leader of India, who devoted his life to serving humanity in the spirit of love and nonviolence. It was in these principles that Martin discovered his method for social reform. More than anything else, those two principles were the key to his achievements. This book is about Black Americans who serve society through the excellence of their achievements. It forms a part of the rich history of Black men and women in America, a history of stunning accomplishments in every field of human endeavor, from literature and art to science, industry, education, diplomacy, athletics, jurisprudence, even polar exploitation. Not all the people in this history had the same ideals, but I think you will find something that all of them have in common. Like Martin Luther King Jr., they all decided to become drum majors, serve humanity. In that principle, whether it was expressed in books, inventions, or song, they found something outside themselves to use as a goal and a guide, something that showed them a way to serve others instead of living only for themselves. Reading the stories of these courageous men and women not only helps us discover the principles that we will use to guide our own lives, but also teaches us about our Black heritage and about America itself. It is crucial for us to know the heroes and heroines of our history and realize that the price we paid in our struggle for equality in America was dear. But we must also understand that we have gotten as far as we have partly because America's democratic system and ideals made it possible. We are still struggling with racism and prejudice, but the great men and women in this series are a tribute to the spirit of our democratic ideals and the system in which they have flourished, and that makes their stories special and worth knowing. Elijah Muhammad. Chapter number 1. In the Wilderness of North America, By the beginning of 1963, preparations were already underway for a massive civil rights march to be held in August in Washington, D.C. A. Philip Randolph, who had organized America's first trade union for blacks nearly 40 years earlier, conceived a plan for the protest, but it was Bayard Rustin, a chief aide to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and a co-founder of an influential anti-discrimination organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, who enlarged the purpose of the demonstration. Rustin cajoled virtually every prominent civil rights leader and organization into participating because he knew that a huge celebrity-studded march on Washington for jobs and freedom would bring the social and economic plight of black Americans to the attention of the public. Anxious to win racial equality, Rustin, King, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and other moderate blacks that had been staging nonviolent acts of social protest, including sit-ins, interstate bus rides, and voter registration drives. Since the mid-1950s, in a multiracial society, no group can make it alone. King counseled his supporters to succeed in a pluralistic society, and an often hostile one at that. The Negro obviously needs organized strength, but that strength would only be effective when it consolidated through constructive alliances with the white majority. Total integration seemed the sole way to wipe out the humiliating system of legalized segregation that the United States had maintained for the past 100 years. Yet the nonviolent tactics and integrationist policies favored by most civil rights leaders and its opponents among America's black population. Later in 1963, as the planning of the March on Washington continued, 10,000 of these more radical blacks held their own meeting in the national capital. The convention took place at the Uline Arena, and its focus was on the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, a fragile-looking man with a slightly oriental cast to his features, who held a Bible in one hand and a Quran, the Islamic Book of Revelations, in the other. The 65-year-old Elijah Muhammad, dressed in a dark suit and a bow tie, rose from his seat and walked to the podium. On his head he wore a small dark pillbox hat that was embroidered with images of a crescent moon, sun, and stars, symbols of the Islamic religion. Upon seeing their spiritual leader before them, the people in the crowd began to chant, Little Lamb," which was a nickname they had given him. Then they cried out the greeting, "Praise be to Allah." Muhammad answered his disciples with that had become his familiar salutation. Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you, in the name of Allah, the most merciful God, to whom all praises are due, the Lord of all the worlds, the most merciful Father, and life-giver to the lost, found, mentally dead so-called Negroes here in the wilderness of North America. Indeed, the man who was called the Messenger of Allah had been a central figure in the lost, found nation of Islam in the wilderness of North America, now called the Muslim Community of America, whose followers are known as Black Muslims for more than 30 years. Founded in the early 1930s, Wallace Fard, the Nation of Islam, with its message of black superiority and resistance to white domination, offered all of its supporters, particularly the black urban poor, a sense of mission in life. The theology of black Muslims claimed that all whites were devils who were about to fall from their positions of power. In their place would rise the black race, the chosen people of Allah. The normally unassuming Muhammad usually described this scenario with the utmost intensity. Alex Haley and Alfred Balk, who attended one of the black Muslim leaders' speeches in early 1963, reported in the Saturday Evening Post. The tiny Muhammad sat impassively. Then, as he rose to speak, he seemed transformed. His movements became abrupt, jerky. He stared piercingly at his audience, spitting out his words in harsh, thin tones. What magical words they proved to be. By instilling racial self-esteem in the black Muslims, Muhammad managed, in the words of author James Baldwin, to heal and redeem drunkards and junkies, to convert people who have come out of prison and to keep them out, to make them chaste and woman virtuous, and to invest both the male and the female with a pride and a serenity that hang about them like an unfailing light. In short, Muhammad accomplished what the church, the government, and other social institutions could not. By the early 1960s, a time when black rights emerged as the most burning issue in America, the Nation of Islam had grown into a nation within a nation. Black Muslims operating their own national newspaper, running their own businesses, claimed for themselves a significant amount of economic power, yet the nation's numerous temples and growing memberships, its solid financial base, its pro-black theology, its fierce spokesman, Malcolm X, and its paramilitary branch, the Fruit of Islam, also made it a target for the fears of moderate blacks and most whites. With the movement's message of black separatism adding its angry voice to the sounds of social unrest, the Nation of Islam, led by parental, delicate-looking Honorable Elijah Muhammad, stood at the most controversial of all movements at the height of the civil rights era. Muhammad was well prepared to deal with the controversy. However, he had known conflict all his life. Chapter number 2. Elijah Muhammad was born under the name of Elijah Poole on October 7, 1897, at Ball Springs near Sandersville, Georgia, a small town between Macon and Atlanta. His first home studio was a sharecropper's shack that barely managed to accommodate Wally and Mary Poole's large family. Elijah was the sixth of their 13 children. Right from the start, Elijah's mother sensed that he was special. As Elijah grew older, his brothers and sisters seemed to think so too. They often asked him to settle their arguments because he was so level-headed. In his respect, Elijah took after his father, a hard-working sharecropper who also served the local black population as a Baptist preacher, in addition to giving instructive sermons in church every Sunday. Wally Poole was known to preach to his children. While Elijah was growing up, his father warned him not to stray from the long dirt road that led to the family's tenant farm near Sandersville. Under no circumstances, Wally Poole said, was Elijah to take a shortcut through the woods? Other children heading home from school might walk that way, but not he. Elijah's curiosity was piqued, however, by that which was forbidden. Usually his brothers or sisters were with him when he left the family grounds. But one warm afternoon in the early 1900s, Elijah found himself alone on the dirt road. Everyone else was at the farm, preparing for the upcoming harvest. His parents had decided that a child such as Elijah would only get in the way. In the coming years, he would be expected to help out on the farm. But on this autumn day, his parents left him on his own. As Elijah looked around the dirt road, the woods loomed large and inviting. At one point, he guessed that his family's small log cabin was on the other side of a clump of trees. Cutting a path through the woods would be the quickest way home, he realized. Elijah had never gone that way before, but he doubted that he would get lost. What he would do, he told himself, was skirt the perimeter of the woods until he reached the edge of the field about his family farm. Arriving there would put him just a stone's throw from his home. As Elijah turned to enter the woods, he picked up a stick and threw it into the forest. He heard it clatter against a tree trunk before it fell on some ferns. A gentle breeze rustled the branches overhead. As Elijah took a few steps underneath the green canopy, he felt a surge of guilt. He knew he was not supposed to venture any farther, yet he backed at turning back. The mystery of the woods had a hold on him. At first, Elijah walked slowly. He did not want to arrive home too early, or else his mother might realize that he had taken a shortcut. He picked up a stick and ran around the trees, enjoying his little adventure. Then he stretched out on the grass. There was no reason to avoid the woods. He reasoned it was a fun place. From now on, he could go there whenever he felt like it. Elijah was still lying on the ground watching the patterns of the branches against the sky when he heard the dull thump of approaching boots. Then came the muffled sound of voices. Perhaps Elijah thought he had spent too much time on the woods, prompting his mother to send a few of his brothers to look for him. If they found him, he would certainly be punished. With his heart beating quickly, the young boy scampered into a nearby thicket and peered through the brambles. When he saw that the approaching figures were not his brothers, he felt relieved. Then, as people came closer, his sense of relief turned into a mixture of fear and disbelief. They were 4 people, as the head of a small party was a white man holding onto a rope. At the other end of the rope was a black man who had it tied about his midsection as though he were a horse or a mule. They were followed by 2 more white men in work clothes. These 2 pushed the captured black, whose hands were tied behind his back to keep him moving. Was this some kind of game? Elijah wondered. Suddenly, the hidden boy recognized the black man. Elijah had seen him in town. He sometimes attended the church where Elijah's father preached. The man looked frightened now, although he was trying hard not to let the others detect how afraid he was. Even when he tripped and fell heavily, his eyes remained fixed in a faraway state. Elijah wanted to shout out to the fallen man, but he felt as though his body were frozen with fear. When the whites began kicking their prisoner and insulting him, Elijah buckled as if he too had been kicked. Silent tears rolled down his face. The man in front proceeded to untie the rope around the black man's wrists. He took one end of the rope and threw it over a sturdy branch, leering at his captive, who still lay face down on the forest floor. He formed the other end into a noose. Then he slipped the hooped rope around the black man's neck. Elijah covered his face with his hands as the victim was hoisted from the ground, spluttering and choking. It only took a matter of minutes. After the lynchers were sure the man was dead, they passed the bottle among themselves and looked up at his body, admiring their handiwork. Then, as though they had just concluded an entire day's work, they strolled away, leaving the strangled man swinging from the tree. The woods were silent except for the sniffles of a small boy. Elijah wiped his eyes and crawled from his hiding place. He wanted to run away as fast as he could to get away from the lifeless face and the hanged man's noose, but something prevented him from doing so. As if in trance, Elijah made his way to where a worn shoe had fallen to the ground. The shoe looked as though it had simply been mislaid, and whoever had lost it would return to claim it. Elijah crouched down to touch the shoe. Suddenly something wet and warm dripped onto the back of his neck. Elijah attempted to brush away whatever it was. He was still transfixed by the show. Then he noticed that his fingertips were covered by a rich red color. Elijah looked up and saw the blood was trickling down the dead man's foot. The gruesome scene would continue to haunt Elijah for many years. Instead of fading from his memory, the nightmarish incident would serve as a vivid reminder to him in the brutal treatment that blacks, especially those in the South, were known to suffer. From 1882 to 1968, nearly 3,500 blacks, 3 times the number of whites, were lynched in the United States. Many more were terrorized by whites but were spared the hangman's noose. To be a Southern black at the turn of the century usually meant a life of hardship and pain as well as danger. By the turn of the century, a wide variety of segregation laws, popularly known as Jim Crow laws, had been established to take away many of the constitutional rights that had been granted to blacks in the years immediately following the Civil War. This segregation, which called for separate but equal public facilities for blacks and whites, invariably led to separate but unequal accommodations for blacks. Moreover, a number of high-handed methods kept blacks from exercising the recently won right to vote. Ballot box stuffing, white primaries, which excluded blacks from participating in the pre-election process, and complicated registration and voting procedures that kept blacks away from the voting booth were some of the ways by which they were denied the right to political representation. By 1908, 8 states, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia had revised their constitutions to disfranchise most blacks. While Elijah was growing up, he was acutely aware of the problem that besieged blacks in the United States. His family, like most sharecroppers, barely managed to make ends meet. In the early 1900s, tenant farming was a common practice in the South. Sharecroppers rented the land they farmed from a social landowner in return for a portion of the season's crop. They sold the remaining portion for a small sum of money, just enough to buy a few articles of clothing and some basic supplies. To help pay their debts, sharecroppers were often compelled to borrow from white creditors, who, spotting an easy mark, lent money to the farmers at exorbitant interest rates. The pools fell victim to this vicious cycle. Added to the hardship of laboring long hours for next to nothing was the ever-increasing amount of money they owed their white creditors. When Elijah was 6 years old, Wally Poole decided to move his family nearly 100 miles southwest to Wynona, Georgia, a small town located 5 miles from Cordell. The Pooles rented a house across the street from the railroad depot, where a train stopped once each day. In Wynona, Wally Poole again attempted to scratch out a living as a sharecropper. Elijah, like all of the Poole children, attended school except when their father asked them to work the fields. Despite having a delicate constitution, Elijah prided himself on contributing as much as his brothers and sisters to the family welfare. He plowed behind a mule, sowed the fields in the spring, and reaped the crops at harvest time. After completing the 5th grade at the age of 14, he left school to work full-time as a hired field hand and sawmill worker. Although Elijah no longer attended classes, he continued to educate himself. Upon returning home after laboring from dawn to dusk, he had one of his older sisters tutor him. Years later, Elijah's mother remembered him poring over the scriptures with tears in his eyes. Elijah said that he cried out of frustrated desire. He boldly wanted to experience the salvation that the Bible promised. Listening to his father's fiery Sunday sermons also made Elijah long to be released from the oppression he saw all around him. During his teens, Elijah exhibited the same quiet authority that had earned him the respect of his older brothers and sisters when he was a child, disapproving of the verbal abuse that his white employers frequently leveled at the black owners. He would speak to his employers in a calm and reasonable voice. I would ask them to just fire me if they didn't like my work, he recalled, but don't curse me. Because of his polite manner and honest reputation, he was often put in charge of the other black workers. Elijah left home when he was 16 but continued to live and work in the same area. 2 years later, in 1915, he met Clara Evans in her church meeting house. She had been born in nearby Houston County, where her father maintained an unusual degree of independence by renting his land for money instead of sharecropping it. One of Clara's sisters, Rose, remembered Elijah's visits to the Evans home on Sunday afternoons after church. He was a polite, reserved young man who tended to wear a blue suit and a tie. He would arrive punctually at 6 o'clock in the evening and leave by 9 because he had to get up early to work in the fields the next day. After 2 years of courtship, Clara Evans and Elijah Poole eloped. They were married on May 2, 1917. After a month-long honeymoon, the newlyweds returned to Wainoa and moved in with Elijah's brother Sam and his family. The two families lived together in a dilapidated wooden shack that belonged to a white landowner named Thompson, who also owned the land the Poole brothers sharecropped. Clara and Elijah's Poole first son, Emmanuel, was born on February 3, 1921, in Clara's parents' home. With a growing family to feed, all told, he would have 19 children. Elijah Poole looked for a more lucrative way to earn a living. He could not find any work locally, so he left his wife and newborn son at home and began to search for an employment in another area. Emmanuel was 1.5 years old when his father finally sent for the family to join him. He had found work in Macon as an employee for the Cherokee Brick and Tile Company. Shortly thereafter, Poole began working for the Southern Railroad Company. When Jim Crow laws were strictly enforced, a white railway worker described his feelings toward his black co-workers in the following manner. In the railway mail service there are a great many Negroes. It is unpleasant for whites to work with them, where it is almost impossible to have different drinking vessels and different towels or places to wash. Another white railway worker voiced a similar attitude. We are assured that Negroes cannot object to segregation. It is the best thing for them as well as ourselves. Racial segregation applied to railroad passengers as well as workers. In 1891, Georgia had passed a law that made it illegal for a black to sit in the same car as a white. By 1900, all southern states that enacted similar laws in waiting rooms, restrooms, railroad cars, and streetcars. As always, these Jim Crow laws resulted in inferior facilities for blacks. The attitude of the white South towards its black inhabitants often led to moments of extreme racial tension. As blacks were reduced to the status of second-class citizens, Southern whites intimidated blacks to keep them in their place. It has been estimated that in the first decade of the 20th century, 40 major race riots took place, with the worst rioting occurring in 1906 in Atlanta, about 100 miles from where Elijah Poole lived. According to official figures, 10 blacks were killed in the Atlanta riot and 60 more were badly beaten. In 1923, the one thing that Poole dreaded most came to pass. One of his white employers physically accosted him. Poole decided to avoid further trouble by moving his family north to Detroit, Michigan. Looking back at his life in Georgia, he commented, "I saw enough of the white man's brutality to last me 26,000 years." Friends of the Race, Chapter 3. In leaving the South, the Pooles became part of a vast black migration. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, approximately 3 million blacks left the South to seek their fortunes in the promised land of the North. According to a 1910 census, 9/10 of the nation's black population lived in the South, but 3 out of 4 blacks resided in rural areas. 50 years later, 3/4 of all black Americans lived in northern cities. Although blacks had been moving north since the time of the Civil War, the largest migration boom occurred around World War I, when nearly 500,000 rural blacks left the South. Race relations certainly played a part in this massive exodus, but the primary force behind the shift in population was an economic one. In the early 1910s, cotton plantations in the South were devastated by a sudden influx of beetles called boll weevils. These cotton-eating insects entered the United States through Mexico and gradually ate their way eastward. ravaging cotton crops throughout the South and drastically reducing the already limited holdings of black tenant farmers. Moreover, hundreds of thousands of blacks were left homeless in 1950, when floodwaters washed over riverbanks in Alabama and Mississippi. During this same period, World War I simulated economic growth in the industrial North. Factories that manufactured military equipment had to increase their productivity, and unskilled and semi-skilled laborers found themselves in great demand to help speed up production. Northern manufacturers went so far as to send industrial agents into the South to search for men to fill the positions left vacant by those who had gone to war. So acute was the shortage of workers that these agents sometimes paid transportation costs for entire families to move north. Filled with the hope of finding more work opportunities and a better life in northern urban centers, most of these black migrants referred to the North as the Promised Land. Yet for the majority of blacks, life in northern cities proved to be anything but ideal. As World War I came to an end, the urgent call for more manpower ceased. Jobs became harder to find because the armistice caused a sudden decrease in manufacturing needs. Moreover, the men who had fought in the war were ready to rejoin the workforce. As the competition for jobs grew fierce, the overabundance of men scrambling for a limited number of positions led to a racial friction. Not surprisingly, job-seeking whites felt threatened by the large number of blacks also looking for work. In 1917, 1 year before the war ended, the animosity of white workers erupted into race riots in both Philadelphia and Chester, Pennsylvania. In July of the same year, the black ghetto of East St. Louis, Illinois, witnessed one of the worst race riots of the century. The violent outburst began when a group of whites in a Ford rode through East St. Louis, randomly spraying bonfire into black homes. As night fell, some blacks mistook a police car for the Ford driven by the white joyriders and shot the car. 2 policemen were killed. Later that night, the whites retaliated. They burned down the homeless of blacks and killed the occupants as they attempted to flee from the burning buildings. At least 39 people were hanged, clubbed, shot, or stabbed to death. A few weeks later, a similar series of hostile events precipitated a riot in Houston, Texas. By 1919, racial relations in America were steadily deteriorating. Activist and editor W.E.B. Du Bois urged blacks in the May issue of The Crisis, the widely read journal published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the nation's leading anti-discrimination organization, to respond to this post-war shift in the fortunes with militant action. We return from the slavery of the uniform which the world's madness demanded us to don to the freedom of civil garb. We return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. But white America had other ideas. Later that year, race riots broke out in about 24 cities across the United States, and in Chicago, Illinois, all told, more than 60 blacks were lynched, yielding a steady stream of bloodshed that prompted James Weldon Johnson, NAACP Field Secretary, to refer the season with the greatest number of riots as the Red Summer. Racial tensions were still running high 4 years later, when Elijah Poole traveled north to Detroit with his wife Clara and their young son Emmanuel, and settled in a house that lacked many bare essentials, including a toilet. During the 1920s, the house would hold 3 more Paoli children, Estelle, Nathaniel, and Lot. Clara would help support the family by working as a domestic. Poole's first job in Detroit was at the American Can Factory. After that, he took a spot on the assembly line at the Chevrolet Motor Company, where the work was as backbreaking as it was tedious. His soft-spoken manner made him popular with his fellow workers, and his dependability impressed his white employers. But because he was black, there was little opportunity for economic advancement. One of the ways that blacks responded to their lowly plight was by organizing themselves, and in the early 1920s, no black was playing a greater role in bringing his people together than Marcus Garvey, an advocate of racial separatism. He promoted a unique vision that captured the imagination of blacks across the nation. As a young man, Garvey campaigned, both in his native Jamaica and in Central America, against the brutal treatment of his fellow West Indian workers. His efforts met little success, but rather than give up, he traveled to London in 1912 with the hope of persuading the British government to change its policies towards colonial workers. Once again, Garvey was unable to find a way to alleviate the suffering of the workers, but the trip paid dividends nonetheless. While in Europe, he traveled and read extensively. The most influential book Garvey studied was Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery, an inspiring account of how the educator rose from being a janitor to the status of America's leading black spokesman. Upon returning to Jamaica in 1914, Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, an organization intent on promoting black pride. When the UNIA failed to take hold in Jamaica, Garvey shifted its headquarters in 1960 to Harlem, New York's black district. By 1919, the UNIA had found its supporters. The organization claimed a worldwide membership of 2 million. At the heart of Garvey's movements was his desire to see blacks educate themselves so that they could achieve economic independence and political power. He urged blacks to shed their sense of disillusionment, to take pride in their race, and to dream of a brighter future. Garvey fostered this program by proving himself to be an emotional speaker as well as a consummate actor. Where is the black man's government? He would ask, where is his king and his kingdom, his navy, his men of big affairs? Telling his listeners that he had never seen such things, he would declare, I would help to make them. And so he did. The UNIA thrilled blacks everywhere by staging spectacular parades in Harlem, especially the one held in August 1920, during the International Convention of the Negro People of the World. The UNIA delegates who came to New York formed as far away as Africa and South America met throughout the month in their organization's headquarters at Liberty Hall. The convention featured religious services and a silent march thoughts through Harlem in addition to conferences and speeches. But it was a magnificent parade that the UNIA organized through the Harlem streets that garnered the most attention and encouraged people to join Garvey's ranks. The parade was led by members of the African Legions, wearing blue military uniforms with bright red stripes on the trousers. Riding on horseback, these marchers possessed military bearing that suggested the hidden power of the black race. Following these riders were 200 black cross nurses in long white dresses and white stockings. Although few of these women were actually nurses, they symbolized the UNIA's commitment to aiding the sick and needy members of the black community. The rest of the parade included the juveniles, a group of proud young Garveyites, thousands of delegates who had come at Garvey's request to discuss the current condition of black life and acquire. Garvey himself rode in an open car, like a head of a state. He rode uniformed with fringed epaulets and carried a cane in white-gloved hands. Although he was short in stature, his long plummed helmet made him easy to single out as leader of the parade. Garvey was easy to single out in another way, unlike the nation's more moderate black leaders. Such as W.E.B. Du Bois and less radical movements such as the NAACP. He strongly opposed integration efforts. In fact, as the 1920s progressed, Garvey promoted himself as a black Moses striving to lead his people back to their African homeland. Though this heady dream never came to fruition, black separatist groups kept his back to Africa concept alive for many decades to come. Garvey did not look only to promote a euphoric sense of hope among his followers. His organization produced some concrete results. He published a black newspaper, Negro World, and encouraged the formation of numerous black businesses. He even began his own shipping company, the Black Star Line, an economic venture operated solely by blacks. The shipping company's aim was to link black commerce all over the world and to transport black Americans to their African homeland. Despite its initial success, the UNEA soon faltered. In 1922, Garvey surprised many of his followers in an attempt to gain support for his Black Back to Africa movement. He formed a pact with the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist organization that was notorious for its violent attacks against blacks. Although he never claimed any abiding love for the Klan, Garvey believed that he and the KKK stood on similar ground on one important issue. The Klan wanted blacks out of the country, and Garvey desired them out too, because they both wholeheartedly supported racial separatism. Garvey went so far as to say that Klansmen were better friends of the black race than the NAACP. In forming such a strange alliance with the Klan, Garvey spurred moderate blacks, especially those in the black press, to attack the UNEA. He supplied them with even more ammunition to carry out their campaign when the Black Star Line, whose finances he had seriously mismanaged from the start, fell into utter ruin. Matters grew worse for Garvey in 1923 when he was convicted of mail fraud. He had made illegal use of America's postal service by selling phony stock for his shipping enterprise. As the Black Star Line sank, the UNEA went down with it. Garvey was sent to a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia in 1925, and 2 years later, after serving half of a 5-year prison sentence, he was deported to Jamaica. U.S. officials never again allowed him entry into America. While Garvey had been launching the UNEA, another black nationalist movement was being formed, Noble Drew Ali's Moorish Temple of America. Ali fired the imagination of lower-class blacks and amassed a large following by claiming that blacks were superior to whites. The white race, he added, was doomed. According to Ali's followers, the Moorish Temple of America was founded after the North Carolina-born Ali visited Morocco. There the king told Ali to teach Islam to black Americans. Ali established his first temple in Newark, New Jersey in 1950 and urged all black Americans to refer to themselves as Moorish Americans. As his teaching spread to the Midwest, Ali issued international identification cards to his followers. These cards bore the symbols of Islam, a star and crescent, an image of clasped hands, and an encircled number 7. The cards also declared that the bearer believed in all divine prophets, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and Confucius. In one sense, Marshall was not far off base. The nation saw inmates convert to the black Muslim religion in droves. When the black man who is hardened criminal hears the teaching of Mr. Muhammad, immediately he makes an about face, Malcolm X explained. Where the warden couldn't straighten him out through solitary confinement, as soon as he became a Muslim, he begins to become a model prisoner right in that institution, far more than whites or so-called Negroes who confessed Christianity. In 1953, Malcolm X was rewarded for his successful work as a recruiter by being appointed Assistant Minister of Temple No. 1. A gifted charismatic speaker, he often displayed of barbed wit. Yes, I am an extremist, he would tell his listeners. The black race in America is in extremely bad condition, yet Malcolm X constantly wanted to learn more about being an effective speaker. And so he tried to spend as much time as possible with his mentor, who had a penchant for speaking in parables. Malcolm X often accompanied Muhammad on his rounds of black Muslims' groceries, whose number had multiplied over the previous few years. The two men frequently engaged in theological discussions as they swept the grocery floors or organized the inventory. Muhammad liked to teach his girlfriend pupil by telling him stories that had a moral. One day he showed Malcolm X a dirty glass and placed it on a counter beside a clean one. "You want to know how to spread my teachings?" Muhammad asked. "Don't condemn if you see a person has a dirty glass of water. Just show them the clean glass of water that you have. When they inspect it, you won't have to say that yours is better." Malcolm X never forgot his teacher's word, although he admitted he sometimes found it difficult to heed Muhammad's advice. "Of all the things that Mr. Muhammad ever was to teach me," Malcolm X later said, "I don't know why that still stands out in my mind, although I haven't always practiced it. I love too much to battle. I'm inclined to tell somebody if his glass of water is dirty." Muhammad asked Malcolm X to leave Detroit in 1953 and live in Chicago for a while so he could begin his training as a minister. Ministers were already in place in the nation's other temples. Muhammad planned for Malcolm X to go from temple to temple and increase the movement's membership at each stop. After months of intensive training, Muhammad sent Malcolm X to Boston to organize Temple Number 11. After he succeeded there, Malcolm X moved on to Philadelphia and Temple Number 12. His unquestioning devotion to the teachings of Muhammad, combined with his artistic anger at the black man's condition, inspired old members and new converts everywhere he went. With a successful track record, Malcolm X was appointed minister of New York's Temple Number 7. Little more than a storefront in June 1954, he helped it grow in size, then moved on to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he opened Temple Number 13, and Hartford, Connecticut, where he founded Temple Number 14. During this period, Malcolm X still returned to Chicago to visit Muhammad. The messenger remained his chief source of inspiration. Occasionally, Malcolm X expressed his impatience with the slowly increasing size of the nation. Muhammad, who sometimes introduced Malcolm X to audiences as the angriest black man in America, would calm him down by saying, "Most people seeing a man in an old touring car going real slow think the man doesn't want to go fast, but the man knows that to drive any faster would destroy the old car. When he gets a fast car, then he will drive at a fast speed. While Malcolm complained about the ineffectiveness of some of the ministers, Muhammad admonished him, "I would rather have a mule I can depend upon than a racehorse that I cannot depend upon." The tremendous growth of the nation continued through 1955, when 15 more temples were established across the country. That December, Muhammad and his followers also purchased synagogue and school at 5335 South Greenwood Avenue in Chicago. The building, which contained classrooms, offices, a small library, and an auditorium, became the movement's largest facility. By the end of the decade, the nation had 50 temples in operation. Not surprisingly, the nation's economic programs expanded as membership increased. As more and more black Muslims businesses opened up, Muhammad and his sons Herbert and Elijah Jr. launched a Back to the Farm program to stimulate interest in owning land. The father believed that whites had convinced blacks to settle for jobs as janitors and elevator operators rather to aspire to being self-sufficient farmers. Build black, buy black was Muhammad's advice to his followers. The small businesses' efforts of the black Muslims eventually expanded into grocery stores, apartment buildings, factories, farms, cleaning establishments, restaurants, bakeries, and service shops for office machines and veterinarian blind repairs. At one point during the 1950s, the combined wealth of these black Muslim enterprises was estimated at $10 million. By 1960, the nation owned $500,000 worth of real estate in the Chicago area alone. To spread the word about black Muslims, Muhammad regularly wrote a column for the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the largest circulation black newspaper in America, boasting more than 300,000 readers. The paper published news about the activities and programs of the nation, although the column proved to be a success when the paper was sold to more conservative owners. Muhammad's features were discontinued. He subsequently wrote a column for the Los Angeles Herald-Dispatch. Then, in 1961, the movement began to publish its own newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, a weekly periodical. It eventually became the largest black publication in the country, with a circulation of 500,000. Chapter 7. We Demand Complete Separation. The black Muslims took a giant step onto the national stage in the summer of 1959, when journalist Mike Wallace narrated a television documentary called The Hate That Produced Hate. The program revealed the core of Elijah Muhammad's white man as a devil theology and shocked most white Americans, who had not realized the extreme degree of discontent among blacks. Prior to the airing of the documentary, churches readily rented out their halls to black Muslims for meetings. But after network television had spread the news of the movement's volatile separatist doctrine, it became much harder for the Nation of Islam to obtain accommodation. By the end of the 1950s, the views of the black Muslims helped threaten to rip apart the social fabric of the country at its seams. Liberal whites and black integrationists were busy supporting the moderate forms of civil rights protest launched by Reverend Martin Luther King, who in 1957 has founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Bayard Rustin and others to challenge racial segregation in public facilities. Roy Wilkins, Executive Secretary of the NAACP, released an official statement in July 1959. The lamb stated Muhammad's radical stance. For years, the NAACP has been opposed to white extremists, preaching hatred of Negro people, as we are equally opposed to Negro extremists preaching against white people simply for the sake of whiteness. Nevertheless, black Muslims remain adamantly opposed to desegregation and were insulted by the Christian philosophy of turning the other cheek. It was inconceivable to them that whites would share with blacks the advantage and privileges of their position. Even more to the point, living in an integrated society with the ancestors of slave owners was one of the black Muslims' darkest nightmares. According to the Nation, men such as King were leading the black masses astray by lobbying for integration. Muhammad said pointedly at King, "The dog wants something to eat from his master, while there is plenty of meat for the dog in the bushes out there if he would go out and hunt for it." Black Muslims viewed integration as a last-ditch attempt by whites to save themselves from the looming destruction of the earth that Muhammad had said might occur in 1970. For a black to live alongside white meant certain contamination. Today's world is floating in corruption. Muhammad said its complete disintegration is both imminent and inescapable. Any man who integrates with the world must share in its integration and destruction. If the black man would listen, he need not to be a part of this certain doom. Among those whom Muhammad regarded as doomed was James Meredith, who was denied admission to the University of Mississippi in 1961. Because of his race, backed by the U.S. Supreme Court, he became the first black to be admitted to the university. It took more than 3,000 federal troops, however, to assume his safety in the classroom. Muhammad spoke out against this example of integration. I wouldn't want the army to think about coming to help me against the white men, to allow me to come to this house, or into the school or this restaurant. He said, if you tell me I don't want you here, that's sufficient, I'm gone. Ironically, the separatist theology of black Muslims attracted some of the same people who, under different circumstances, might have menaced them with the hangman's noose. George Lincoln Rockwell, head of the American Nazi Party, a white supremacist group, attended a black Muslim rally in Washington, D.C. to offer his support against racially mixed marriages. Muhammad had already made his position on interracial marriage quite clear. What do we want to marry a white woman for? He asked. The very desire there is ignorant and evil. It's against divine law for either side to integrate in such a way. As the 1960s progressed, Muhammad began to speak of a separate state for blacks within the United States. Just as Wallace Farad had done years earlier, the black Muslim leader stated in a 1963 interview with the New York Times, "The Negro must think in terms for bettering himself, and this he can only do by thinking in terms of his own black civilization. If black Americans would not go back to Africa as Marcus Garvey had suggested, then they would be granted their own homeland in the United States. We believe that our former slave masters are obligated to maintain and supply our needs in this separate territory for the next 20 to 25 years, until we are able to produce and supply our own needs." Muhammad said, "Since we cannot get along with them in peace and equality, we demand complete separation." When slavery was legally abolished in 1865, there had been some discussion of free slaves receiving 40 acres and a mule as compensations for the injustice they had been forced to suffer. Nearly 100 years later, Muhammad was maintaining that blacks had yet to shake off the yoke of slavery. There were other shackles to discard as well. In the early 1960s, prison authorities denied black Muslims the right to practice their religion behind bars. Some of the inmates protested that 2 of their cases were eventually heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. In one of the suits, 10 black Muslim inmates in California claimed that the removal of their religion's books violated the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed freedom of religion. In the other case, 3 black Muslims in a New York prison accused the authorities of violating the Civil Rights Act of 1871, which maintains that all people may worship their chosen religion without interference from the state. The Supreme Court ruled in both cases that it was constitutionally permissible for black Muslims to be denied the right to practice their religion because their theology threatened national security. The federal government decided to take an even more pronounced step toward protecting the American public from the nation when it began to keep track of the movement's members. The Fruit of Islam, the nation's highly trained paramilitary corps, particularly worried government officials, who surmised that Muhammad was amassing a small but effective army. Its members' telephones were wiretapped, their personal activities were closely monitored by the FBI. Before long, blacks began to complain that one visit to a black Muslim temple was enough of a reason for them to be placed under FBI surveillance. Muhammad surely pointed out that the FBI could catch all the lynchers and school bombers in the South with a fraction of the agents assigned to watch him. Malcolm X claimed that no fewer than 15 FBI agents watched Temple No. 7, his main headquarters. Malcolm X, however, gave the authorities plenty of reasons to worry. His public speaking style had grown more flamboyant and increasingly militant over the years. He often alluded in his speech to violence and destruction, telling his listeners such things as, "You don't stick a knife in a man's back 9 inches and pull out 6 inches and say you're making progress. And like Samson, I am all ready to pull down the white man's temple." Always smartly dressed in a dark suit and narrow tie like the model businessman, Malcolm X was indeed an imposing figure. Reporters and television crews flocked to him whenever they wanted a comment by the black Muslims. On those occasions, Malcolm X would persist in advising the media to talk directly to Muhammad. Sometimes he would even supply them with photographs of the messenger. Yet the newsmen kept on coming back to Malcolm X because he was much more colorful. His rhetoric was so spellbinding, in fact, that he became one of the most popular lecturers on the college circuit. The young clergyman embodied the nation's conception of the angry face of Black America. In 1962, Malcolm X found himself even closer to the center of the limelight. Muhammad appointed him National Minister of the nation. The messenger was 65 years old and was suffering from chronic asthma and bronchitis. On the advice of his doctor, he taught a modest 2-bedroom house in Phoenix, Arizona, to serve as a winter retreat. Almost as soon as Muhammad, along with his family and 3 aides, moved away from Chicago, discord broke out among Malcolm X, young Ali, the nation's head of the public relations, Raymond Sharif, the leaders of the Fruit of Islam, and other officers Muhammad had put in charge of the black Muslims and their multi-million-dollar businesses. During the next few years, an epic struggle for control of the movement would threaten to fracture the nation from within. Chapter number 8. The Chickens Come Home to Roost. Bitter rivalries within the Nation of Islam grew more pronounced in April 1962, when a group of black Muslims in Los Angeles confronted the local police. The encounter left 1 Nation member dead and a dozen more wounded. Malcolm X responded to the violence by saying that black Muslims should retaliate in kind against the people. The other leaders of the nation wanted to avoid further trouble with the authorities, however, and permitted him to do nothing other than make angry speeches. In his public addresses, Malcolm X had already been focusing on political matters instead of religious issues for some time, to give him less of a voice in the movement. He was stripped of his responsibilities as editor of Muhammad Speaks, and Elijah Muhammad's son Herbert ordered the newspaper's staff to limit its coverage of Malcolm X's activities. A short time later, the national minister was told by messenger to stop appearing on network television news broadcasts. The rift continued into 1963, when 2 of Muhammad's former secretaries, both in their 20s, filed paternity suits against the nation's leader, claiming that the 66-year-old Muhammad had fathered their 4 children in an attempt to uncover the truth. Malcolm X interviewed the 2 women. They not only provided him with evidence to support their claims, but told him Muhammad had become convinced that Muhammad was turning against him. These revelations deeply shook the dynamic young minister's faith in his mentor. Still, Malcolm X decided to hear from Muhammad, and so he made a trip to the older man's home in Phoenix. Side by side, the 2 ministers walked around Muhammad's swimming pool. Malcolm X listened closely as Muhammad threw on biblical parables comparing himself with King David and Noah, who had also suffered moral lapses. To justify his own behavior, Muhammad did not deny the charges that had been leveled against him. Malcolm X noticed. Consequently, his faith in the movement began to wane. What might not be construed as a kiss of death between the 2 men occurred later in 1963. At a rally in Philadelphia, Muhammad embraced Malcolm X in front of the assembly and told the crowd, "This is my most faithful, hard-working minister. He will follow me until he dies." That embrace marked the last time they were ever seen together in public. Malcolm X replaced his loss of faith in Muhammad's moral authority by channeling his energies into black nationalist activities. On August 28, 1963, nearly 250,000 demonstrations participated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that A. Philip Randolph and Barry Rustin organized in the nation's capital. The day was filled with a parade of people singing hymns as they marched from the Washington's monument to the Lincoln Memorial. It culminated in a series of powerful speeches in support of civil rights. Martin Luther King, who was the last speaker of the day, called the massive protest an attempt to arouse the conscience of the nation over the economic plight of the Negro. Malcolm X had quite a different reaction to the day's events. "I don't believe we're going to overcome by singing," he told the reporters. "If you're going to get yourself a 45 and start singing, 'We shall overcome, I'm with you,' more and more." The barrel of a gun seemed to him the only means for making white America take notice of its black citizens. Such incendiary comments kept Malcolm X in the bad graces of the nation. Finally, things came to a climax. Following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, Malcolm X told the press that he believed the hate in whites had not stopped at the killing of blacks but had spread unchecked until they had finally struck down the country's head of state. Malcolm X's public response to Kennedy slaying was, "The chickens had come to roost." Malcolm X's call-out's comment resulted in a summons to Phoenix, where Muhammad reprimanded him. "That was very ill-timed," the nation's leader said. "A statement like that can make it hard on Muslims in general. I have to silence you for the next 90 days, so that Muslims everywhere can disassociate themselves from the blunder." In view of their deteriorating relationship, Malcolm X's unpopular statement about Kennedy may very well have served as a pretext for Muhammad to check the power of his chief spokesman. To regain Muhammad's favor, Malcolm X journeyed to Miami, Florida in February 1964 to meet with Cassius Clay, a popular boxer who had just secretly converted to Islam and changed his name to Muhammad Ali. The 28-year-old minister believed that by convincing Ali to associate himself with the nation, the movement will gain a lot of positive publicity and might restore Elijah Muhammad's confidence in his chief minister. Along with it, Ali publicly acknowledged his conversion on February 26, the day after he won the heavyweight title in a match against Tony Liston. As time wore on, Ali would prove to a substantial amount of his earnings to the movement. Yet Malcolm X's fruitful visit with Ali did little to change Muhammad's attitude. Malcolm X soon found out just how little. Toward the end of his 90-day suspension, several members of Harlem's Temple No. 7 said that a high-ranking black Muslim had instructed them to assassinate Malcolm X. Their admission left the young clergyman stunned. "I felt like something in nature had failed, like the sun or the stars," he observed. There could be one response. In March 1964, Malcolm X announced that he was leaving the nation to form a new organization, Muslim Mosque Incorporated. In its charter members, totaling about 50 people, were former supporters of the nation. Yet Malcolm X welcomed blacks of all religion denominations to join this militant group. Whites were also invited to contribute money and ideas. The formation of a new black Muslim organization enraged Muhammad and other nation leaders. They branded Malcolm X a traitor and vilified him in Muhammad Speaks. They soon had even more of a reason to regard Malcolm X as their enemy. Less than a month after he formed a Muslim Mosque Incorporated, he went on a spiritual pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. There he learned firsthand that a doctrine of black supremacy had no place in traditional Islam. Upon his return to the United States in late May, he told the press that he had been spellbound by the graciousness I see displayed all around me by people of all colors, and proceeded to denounce the racist policies of the nation. For 12 long years I lived within the narrow-minded confines of a straight-jacket world created by my strong belief Elijah Muhammad was a messenger direct from God himself, and my faith in what I now see to be a pseudo-religious philosophy that he preaches. Around this time, Muhammad's son Akbar, who was studying Islamic law at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt, also broke ranks with the nation. Akbar said of his father, "His concocted religious teachings are far from, and in most cases diametrically opposed to Islam, and secondarily because of its politically sterile philosophy of the Afro-Americans struggle. Just 1 year earlier, Akbar had seen his brother Wallace and cousin Hassan Sharif pushed out of the movement. There are members of the top echelon in the movement who do not go along with Elijah Muhammad, Akbar maintained, but they stay because they are getting good salary. Malcolm X kept the heat on the nation. He insisted that Muhammad's movement had missed a great opportunity by failing to work with other civil rights organizations to find a better way of life for blacks. Elijah spends his time denouncing white people and my followers, he said. Why doesn't he denounce the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council? Why doesn't he send followers to Mississippi and Florida to help the Negro and white civil rights volunteers who are trying to get to better things there? To accomplish these tasks, Malcolm X formed the Organization of African American Unity, a non-religious offshoot of Muslim Mosque Incorporated. As 1964 drew to an end, disciples of the nation assaulted a number of Malcolm X's aides. Malcolm X himself was kept under surveillance by both the nation and the FBI, leading him to suspect that they had organized a conspiracy against him. In December, he began to receive a series of death threats. In early February 1965, a rumor popped up that the French government had uncovered a plot to kill Malcolm X while he was in Paris. In the middle of the month, his home in East Elmhurst, New York, was firebombed. He and his family barely managed to escape from their burning house. Then, barely a week later, on February 21st, Malcolm X was gunned down by 3 men during a rally at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. Talmadge Hayer, the only one of their 3 assassins to be arrested at the scene of the crime, denied having ties with the nation. Muhammad and the nation also disavowed having any involvement in Malcolm X's murder, although most observers thought otherwise and guessed that there would be a bloodbath between the rival factions. Indeed, these prophecies became a reality when mosques were burned down in New York and San Francisco. In Chicago, members of the Fruit of Islam armed themselves to protect the life of Muhammad, who described Malcolm X as a star who had gone astray. The nation leader said that the slain minister got what he preached because he had urged blacks to arm themselves. The call to arms, Muhammad says, belongs to no one but Allah. Elbridge Cleaver, who in 1967 became Minister of Information of the militant Black Panther Party, a black nationalist group that did not shy away from using violence, maintained there was a time in the 1960s where most blacks thought about becoming black Muslims, but by the end of the decade the movement's powerful dominion over the black imagination had begun to wane. Filled with a growing sense of desperation, the nation's black ghettos had periodically erupted into destructive riots. Instead of trying to unify the different strands of black activists, Muhammad had chosen to keep the nation out of the public spotlight. Nevertheless, as the 1970s began, the nation still claimed its share of followers. Muhammad continued to rule them from his house in Phoenix, which had now become his permanent residence. Befitting powerful yet isolated man, he had his home monitored by closed-circuit cameras. On August 12, 1972, Muhammad's wife Clara died at the age of 72. Ever since 1946, when her husband was released from prison, she had remained in the background, raising her children and acting as a role model for other black Muslim women. In the years immediately following her death, Muhammad's public appearances remained few and far between. When Muhammad finally emerged from isolation in 1974, he seemed to have experienced a change of heart. During one meeting he said to his followers, "The slave master has given you all he could give you. He gave you freedom. Now get something for yourself." Instead of blaming whites for the current status of blacks, he placed the burden of advancement on his own people. It was to be one of his last public statements. On February 26, 1975, just 6 days before the annual Savior's Day, convention, Elijah Muhammad died of a heart failure at Mercy Hospital in Chicago. He was 77 years old. Because Muhammad had not written a will, his 19 legitimate and illegitimate children were forced to contend for his multi-million-dollar estate. The legal dispute was especially hard-fought because his assets were estimated at $5.7 million. Today, the black Muslims continue to flourish, although without Elijah Muhammad as their leader. The religious movement has splintered into different factions. Denouncing some of his father's philosophies, Muhammad's son Wallace formed a branch of the nation that he opened to all races. Other new sects, such as the Anasaros, Allah, and the 5% Nation, have chosen to emphasize more mystical aspects of the movement. The ministry of Louis Farrakhan, the nation's current leader, remains closest to the original precepts of the messenger. For more than 40 years, Elijah Muhammad taught blacks to feel proud of their racial heritage. He carried out his mission by drawing on personal experience. He had, after all, forged his own identity through years of hardship and suffering. As James Baldwin put it shortly after meeting Muhammad at his Chicago home in the early 1960s, the central quality of Elijah's face is pain, and his smile is a witness to it. Pain so old and deep and black.